Good afternoon, everyone, to this Friday's IESVic seminar. It's really delightful for me to welcome Dave Sinton, who is still a young but old friend and colleague. We had Dave started his academic career after finishing his PhD at UVic and became right away a member of IESVic. And we had, I remember those years very fondly. We had a lot of fun working on various projects, and they've built up quite a team in the area of microfluidics for energy systems. He had also some work related to health applications and mentoring a lot of students. On the side, he used to do gigs, drumming for a band. I think at some point it became unsustainable and he had to give up the drumming. What was a loss to rock and roll became a gain to science and engineering. And then eventually he left. He held the Canada Research Chair here at IESVic and at UVic Mechanical Engineering. And then went to Toronto, where he blazed the trail in microfluidics applications, again in health and energy applications. He's had a huge impact, won numerous awards. Perhaps one of the ones that I should mention is the prestigious NSERC Stacey Memorial Award and a few other fellowships, etc. And still carrying on mentoring students. I saw one of the undergraduate teams won an award for carbon sequestration, the Elon Musk award last year. So, and today he's going to tell us how small things can have a big impact. So,
well, thanks. Thanks so much, Ned, and thanks for having me back. And this is great to see old friends and great to be back. So thanks for indulging me here, I should say, and hi to folks online. The title here, 10 Reasons to Love Tiny Pipes, or the subtitle, really comes from a lecture that I gave to honor Ned's many contributions to IESVic, and so that's a bit of a throwback. And I don't have all 10 more reasons. In fact, I don't think I had 10 reasons in the first one, but I have at least 10 self-indulgent personal stories that I'll share. So I promise that much. So starting with those, let's see if I can get to my self-indulgent personal stories here. There we go. Yeah, so this is a group that gathered in IESVic. Here, I think this was close to when I left. I'm not sure why we're facing all in one direction. I had to Photoshop Ned into on the top of somebody there. But anyway, that was marking the end of a great period. And one takeaway from this talk, maybe the most important takeaway from this talk, is that even though often I think about patents and papers and prizes, it's really all about the people, and that's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. And in my professional history, a lot of those people are connected to UVic here. Some special ones on the board, but more here. Left to right, Jeff Coleman has gone on to a great career here in industry, and Angela. A couple special folks. Eric is a professor, Canada Research Chair at Simon Fraser University, co-supervised with Ted and I back in the day. Amy Bazelak has the office next door to me, at University of Toronto, Canada Research Chair. Her husband, Jason, also a professor there, teaching professor. John McKechnie, some will remember here, was sober some of the time at UVic when he was here, and really great guy. Wasn't particularly sober at that time, but he's now a professor at University of Nottingham doing really great stuff. And I think you folks see some of his work. Those of you, and there's many of you at UVic who are in the systems modeling stuff. John's really a life cycle assessment all-star. So a pretty great crop for a first group. Some more pictures there. Mohsen here, who's now at UVic, of course. It's your colleague. And who else have we got here? Oh, Sam and Kings. I know that didn't exist anymore, but that's a shame. And home renovations, all these things that I associate with my time here. Two stories I'm going to tell today. One is about microfluidics for energy applications, current operations. So this is you can think of this as Dave trying to find a market, a current market for microfluidics energy applications. And here again, we have UVic All-Stars Tom DeHaas, who was an undergrad here, and I taught, and he started an MN at University of Toronto before I got there, and he actually showed up at my interview talk, and afterwards he said, "Hey, if you get a job here, I'd like to work with you." I said, "That's great, Tom, but I got something else I got to do today. I got to get this job." And Stuart Kinnair, who's a UVic business guy, they laid this company along with me, and I'll tell you the story of how this got started and what they do now. It's 30 people based out of Calgary and labs in Edmonton. And then the other half of the story I'm going to tell today is about CO2 conversion. And this is a familiar group. How do I hide this thing? Get it over here. Hide. Does that say that one?
High floating heating control.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so this is Tom Berdini, who is a proud UVic grad and Andrew student. And Andrew was kind enough to recommend him to me when I had started in Toronto, or a few years after I'd started. So Tom went and did a fantastic PhD with me, really transformed our group and got us into I'm going to talk about the second half today, CO2 conversion, electrocatalytic systems. He's a real all-star. And this is his group, circa a week ago, 2 weeks ago, in Delft. So I visited him there. I had to be over there for another reason. And I realized that country is like this big. Initially I said, I can't visit Tom because he's way down in Delft and I'm going to Amsterdam and over here. And then I realized, no, I can just take a cab. Like this is not Canada we're talking about. It's hardly even BEI. So it was great. So I got to connect with him and see his group. And it's really, that's one of the great, I mentioned a little bit sentimentally, I guess, that it's really about the people. And it's so cool to see the family that's come out of UVic, that's come out of my group in Toronto, and see them populate over the world. Great. My clicker's not working today. Well, maybe it's because let's try this. There we go. So forgive me if I jam a few too many slides in here, but I feel like I'm kind of reporting on 10 years, right? What I did post UVic time. So the first was really microfluidics and nanofluidics, small, tiny pipes, and they're for applications where information was the product. In almost all of history, microfluidics has been used as a diagnostic. It's been used to detect cancer. It's been used to count blood cells, etc. Ultimately, information was the product, data was the product, fluid was something you were looking at, and so microfluidics made sense. The second half is a very, very different game, and that's where fluid is the product. And if you get confused and you start to use systems that look like this for applications that look like this, you quickly get into trouble. I made the world's most expensive biodiesel. It was, so the chip, it cost me like 10,000 or something by the time you factor in some grad student time and this and that. And I think we made 10 microliters or below that. So it was $10 billion a liter. Like this was expensive stuff, right? So you realize that's not, when you're off by one order of magnitude, you got a great engineering challenge. When you're off by 9 or more, you're just got the wrong tools, right? That's just total insanity. So never apply these to this, right? So that doesn't mean you can't take some of your expertise here, but the systems are going to look different. They're not going to look like chips. So there's two different stories here, and it's very clear. If information is a product, you can use these. If fluid's a product, you've got to use systems at scale. So first bit, where information is the product, this was really 2011 to 2016 for me. If you look at the historical view of world energy, lots of folks know this plot. I used to talk about this in the context of how we find new sources and we've replaced old sources, but that was incorrect, right? We don't actually replace anything, do we? I mean, there's no precedent in history for replacing energy sources. We just add on. So we're still burning the same amount of biomass, right? But we added a bunch of coal, added a bunch of oil, added a bunch of gas. And I think folks in this room and folks online, and I would agree, we really have to change that. At the same time, it does give me pause that there is zero historical precedent for doing less. We do add new sources. We add efficiency. And we do not subtract. And so the result for me here is that really the demand will persist. So that motivates a few things. One is growing these renewable uses and renewable sources. The other one is doing something with the CO2 here and then looking at where these current flows go to and can we replace those with renewable sources. This is that same chart, but shown for the current mix, and you can see that the 85% fossil fuels, of course, very familiar to those in this room. That's the challenge, and it's the CO2 associated with that. And this CO2 also, when you think about a small scale fluids guy like I am, it really gives me pause to think a ton of CO2, and it took a ton to get me out here. Didn't it, Curran? Or by the time I get back, it'll be a ton. That'll be my share of the plane. That's a big ball, right? That's a lot of fluid for a small scale fluids guy. And I can't resist this. Does anyone know what this person is doing? Speaking of big balls of gas. They're stealing natural gas. Natural gas is really hard to steal, right? Anyway, it gets to energy density. Yeah. What are the biggest uses for this big fluid, this fluid that we produce so much of? Current sources. So this is around 2011. I started to look at what do we use CO2 for now? And you can probably guess there's some uses up here. Sorry for the small font, but there's beverages and there's some food. I'm a San Pellegrino guy. But the big blue one is, of course, oil recovery, right? So that's where we use it. And Canada has the world's largest CO2 project in the world. And don't feel bad if you didn't know that. Most Canadians don't. It's just me and a couple guys in Saskatchewan that seem to acknowledge this. But it's a huge CO2 project, and it's taken a lot of CO2 over the years. There's some environmental benefit, there's some economic benefit, but this thing makes nobody happy. The environmentalists aren't happy because ultimately it's producing oil. The oil guys aren't happy. Why? It's expensive, right? Yeah, we got a CO2 problem. We can't get enough, right? Just different perspective. That kind of makes no. So I think there's a future for some of this. I think it's important. It's already been important, arguably. But do I want to, invest all the rest of my career in this particular technology? Probably not. It's kind of a grumpy middle ground. We need some of it. We're doing a lot of it. We'll see. So this was our first chip in this area. Can we inform these operations? Can we see how much CO2 is moving into the oil? Can we see how much oil is coming out? This was a few years ago, eventually got published, but it had been in the works for a while. And I like this one because it's the world's simplest microfluidic chip. It is a straight channel with a dead end. Like, it does not get simpler. And you can see the oil phase here. It's fluorescent. You can see it expand as CO2 comes in, and you get to some serious pressures here. And you can see the oil and hydrocarbons move into the CO2 phase. So this part here, the environmentalists are getting happy, and then here the oil people are getting happy. No one's entirely happy. But it was an interesting example of how microfluidics can understand these systems on a time scale at which current operations could not provide that information. Just one more example in this suite of technologies. When I went to conferences, I used to brag about how microfluidics is really good for energy and understanding energy systems and CO2 and flows and oil and gas, because we can get all these temperatures and pressures. We can study these things with precision. But I'd never done a real phase diagram, and we've all got textbooks at home with, unless you sold your textbooks, don't sell your textbooks, with pressure and temperature, right? This is classic stuff. And why don't we do this? Why don't we have this on a chip? So this was a fun project. It was really a tour de force of thermal fluids engineering. And this one didn't work, but you can kind of imagine inlet and outlet, high pressure, low pressure, a bunch of essentially taps coming off here, and you should be able to see, and in high temperature, low temperature, you should be able to see the phase diagram manifest in a real physical system. So that one didn't work, but a version like this did, and this was big fun. You could see that this is over 1,000 what they call pressure, volume, temperature cells reporting for duty. And here, what do we got here? We've got low temperature, right? High pressure, liquid. And as we come across here, this constant pressure line, we come across here, and boom, first gas. That's the edge of the phase boundary, right? And then the gas grows as we move across higher temperature, higher temperature, higher temperature until we get to pure gas. So that's the phase envelope. And here, this is cool. There's the transition, right? That supercritical fluid transition. Just, I think it's 0.1 of a degree or something. This little reactor is beside that one, and boom, the phase boundary disappears. And you've got supercritical fluid. You've got one phase that's supercritical. Big fun. And if you were to go, and by the way, in the context of trying to make a business case for this stuff, this is, after all, information's a product. What do people pay for this information now? Well, if you went to a service provider for industrial fluids and said, I want to know the phase properties of this fluid at this temperature and this pressure, they'd say, sure, $5,000. So we thought there was some opportunity here when you've got this ability to parallelize. This was cute. I'll just show this little video here. You can kind of cruise around. This is what we call our liquid piston, and it compresses the fluid up there. And once it gets settled, you can see the two phases come out. And then you can cruise right if you want to go higher temperature and lower pressure. So you can kind of peruse the thermodynamic space in kind of a Blair Witch fashion. Did a little foray into nanoscale fluids, nanofluidics. I won't drag you through all the details, but if anyone's interested, we wrote a paper reviewing all of this work and some friends at Boston University in this review. It was an interesting project, an interesting few years focusing on that stuff. If microfluidics, I think of as kind of the convenience scale. Everything works, making the systems is not that hard. Well, the first time the student tries it, it doesn't work, but then the next time it's okay. And you can see it, put it on a microscope. It all kind of works. The phase behavior you measure is relevant to large scales. There's nothing weird. Nanofluidics is terrible. It's size dependent, hard to build, hard to see, expensive, super painful, interesting from a fundamental properties perspective, but not super convenient. We had to reduce the price. So if you're doing something in a lab, it's different than doing it in industry. So we have to use this really old school microfluidics, no plastics, because we're working with high temperatures, high pressures, industrial conditions, and industrial solvents and all sorts of nasty stuff. So it has to be. So the only result was to make the wafers, the bits on the wafer small. So this got that job done and really made the case for a company. And so that group of people I showed now that's based in Calgary and Edmonton, that's this startup, Interface Fluidics, and they'll do chemical-based testing for heavy industry, any fluid. But to date, the clients have been almost exclusively chemical companies on the bottom and then oil companies on top. And a standard place that Interface Fluidics makes money and pays bills is by testing chemicals for oil companies. Is this going to work? Is this going to get the gunk out of my pipeline, or is this going to cause a problem here? That's the kind of stuff. We're tooling up to answer more complex questions, but right now the market isn't there. The market wants these kind of questions, so we'll see. Equinor is a big sponsor of this, and Techstars, and it's covered up there. But Creative Destruction Labs, this was a really helpful incubator for us. Okay, I'm going to blast through, because I want to get to CO2 conversion, electrocatalysis. I'm going to blast through a few other applications where information was the product. One was in, Kern and I were just talking about different places to store CO2. We've been hoping to work on this in an industrial sense for a decade, but no money, right? But that's changing. So there's more and more interest in this, and I was trying to squeeze out of Kern and Heather different benefits of different types of aquifers and the risks and hazards associated with each. This was a way back study where we looked at using microfluidics to understand where the CO2 is flowing and we just flexed all our usual muscles. We could see the phase behavior in here. This was cute. The CO2 moved into solution, it acidified it, so it changed the fluorescence output of the brine here. So we could actually see the fluid in solution. This looks like a simulation, but it's not. It's experimental data. And we'd ultimately see salt formation, which is good current, right? From a perspective of locking in that CO2, terrible from a perspective of injectivity and operations here. So anyway, this sort of thing can answer lots of neat questions, I think, and hopefully its time has come that someone's gonna actually pay for these kinds of for answers to these kinds of questions. We did a foray in bio stuff. I was really interested in how we could contribute. You think of microfluidics has done a lot of stuff with cells. Why couldn't we work with photosynthetic organisms? And so we did a bunch of work in this area. We wrote this review to really get our handles around all of the efficiencies, all the losses associated with biological systems. There's a lot as you go from the sun all the way to a product. And then there's a variety of products one can make, of course. This one is the one where there's a carbon benefit. It's a big market, but the margins are just kill you small. So I once wrote a grant with a guy at IESVic actually, and we were working for a bit on it. And then I said, hey, I thought we were going to make biofuel. And he said, oh yeah, we always write our grants to say biofuel, but then we just go make a nutraceutical, right? Because they're, it's $15,000 a kilogram as opposed to sub 1. Understandable, but the challenge of going from here all the way to here, we ultimately abandoned this. I will show you a couple highlights. One is in the light stuff. We're good at organizing light in small scales. So we looked at, can we look at these photosynthetic organisms and use our usual toolbox to get a gradient of conditions here. And I like this because we could look at ammonia concentration versus light. And if you look in the literature, there's a bit of an argument that some guys say, well, ammonia concentration doesn't matter. And then ammonia concentration is really important. And they were both right. But they were just at different irradiance levels, right? So this is just an example of when you have a highly multi-parameter space, microfluidics for high throughput experiments can be useful. You can find your sweet spot where you can make lots of fat. Other examples, we did some work with displays and how to give the reactors very precise amounts of light and tune the wavelengths and stuff like that. And here we got just buckets of data, and I would argue also better data than the traditional way to study these green goops, these photosynthetic organisms as flasks. And what light is that flask getting? Well, very different, 1 centimeter deep than at the surface. So they say, well, we stir our flasks. Well, okay, but then it's in some frequency. It's very hard to control the system, whereas microfluidics can provide some control. Last up on information. This is a recent work we're doing with Ever Technologies. These guys are super fun. They took a bunch of oil and gas folks and billions of dollars worth of oil and gas technology and are applying it to geothermal. In other words, they're drilling down and across kilometers. Do you guys know this? Have you guys seen this company, EverTech? So that to do hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas, right? You have to go down into a seam and then across through a narrow pay band, and it's really hard to do that. But the oil and gas industry spent billions of dollars to figure that out, and now they could drill, they can drill kilometers down and across town, to a Esquimalt and land in a living room. It's that precise. So these guys took that and said, well, if we can drill that precisely in rock, we can drill down and across, and we can meet it. So it's like a moonshot for drilling in rock, right? But they drilled a closed loop, and when you have a closed loop, now you can do geothermal energy like a radiator. So super fun tech. They've raised some money, we'll see. But what they can do now that you've got a closed tech for your geothermal operation, a closed radiator, you can get fancy fluids. So they've engaged us to develop some cool things that can beat water. And we're using paraffins that through phase change can draw a little bit more latent heat out of their pipes. And again here, we're getting information out. We're informing them, hey, you could do this. They're going to have to take that and do that at scale in their systems. Okay, chapter 2. What if we said, well, we've done everything we could possibly be useful for in the world in terms of information. We've tried to inform sequestration operations, but nobody wanted to pay us. We informed oil and gas, those guys wanted to pay us. We informed CO2, advanced oil recovery, those guys paid a bit. We tried some biological stuff. We tried some nanoscale stuff. What's next? Geothermal stuff. Let's try to make some actual product. And this is humbling. I mentioned the example of where I made the most expensive biodiesel. This is tricky because it's the fluid that you ultimately want to make is what? What do you want to convert CO2 into? If there was a IESVic startup, of which there are some great ones, there was a IESVic startup that kicked off tomorrow, and they were making sunglasses from CO2. I would probably buy a pair of the sunglasses, right? It's cool. Why not? And I would support the company. It might even be a good business, but is it a carbon tech? No, right? Why? Just ask yourself how many tons of sunglasses you bought last year. Sub 1 ton for sure, right? Probably none. So what did you buy tons of last year? We all know not much, right? Not much, but we all bought tons of fuel and we bought tons of feedstocks. We bought tons of ethylene. What about this stuff? So ultimately, if CO2 needs to be converted into something as a carbon tech, sunglasses are cool, a good business perhaps. But if you really are interested in carbon, then it has to go into something where either you store it or in the conversion world, it goes into something that we demand at the millions of tons level. Okay, so we have this vision for, which is increasingly shared around the world, for electrocatalytic conversion. And here, coming back to my IESVic roots in fuel cells technology, I learned from Ned and others here, and running that in reverse a little bit, running an electrolyzer, not a hydrogen electrolyzer, but one that takes CO2 as an input, does electrocatalytic reduction, and turns that back into the chemicals and the fuels that we demand. And we look at that in a few different ways. First, on the upstream side, we're very interested in how do we integrate with industrial sources now, but also with DAC and direct air capture ultimately. In the cell, we're interested in a lot of things that Ned would find familiar, right? Energy and efficiency, in this case, carbon efficiency. And then on the downstream, what are we making? Are we making something that's actual value? So I'm going to tell a few stories here in each section. I'm going to focus only on the last 2 years, but this has been a journey and one where I've worked with the Sargent group at U of T. They're really materials. They do everything, but they're really materials catalysis people, and they're good electrochemists, which is great because I'm not an electrochemist. And we started small in every sense of the word. So CO, that's sort of the most basic thing you could make from CO2. It's a small molecule, ultimately small market, and we use small scale tech to do it. But it was a starting point. And as the field and we have changed over the last 5 years, we've moved towards bigger products, ethylene, ethanol, now increasingly propanol, and bigger systems. So this is where I think the mechanical engineers and the team, the Tom Berdinis and others really started to strut, was in designing physical systems that could do all what mechanical engineers need to do on the team. They need to get reactants to the site. They've got to get products away. They've got to keep the pH, and they've got to get electrons in there. And it's damn hard. But there's lots to be gained here. And what's been cool is to see a field where really the all-stars were materials people, catalyst people, electrochemists, really need those mechanical engineers, because you can't demonstrate, you got a great catalyst and it works great at 2 milliamps per centimeter squared. Nobody cares. 8 years ago, they cared. You get a cool paper. Now they're like, nope, that's not practical. You need to find yourself a system. You need to get your reactants and your products and your electrons away. You need a mechanical engineer. We built these into larger scale systems. I'll talk about that. 2 X prizes here. We're serial X prize losers, and we continue to benefit from that. On the input side, I mentioned cheap CO2, low purity, ubiquitous source. The field to date almost exclusively has worked with pure CO2. And that's okay. It's hard enough, right? Making ethylene out of CO2 is damn hard. So starting from pure CO2, it sure seems like the right place to start. Ultimately, though, the field can't end there. Why? Because, as Peter said, same reason the oil guys don't like CO2, EOR. CO2 is expensive. Pure CO2 is expensive. And it's hard to get, right? So cheap CO2, low purity. And at the end of the talk, I'll talk about our DAC effort, which is the ultimate upstream air. In the cell, more productive, more efficient, more stable. You think of where hydrogen fuel cells are now, CO2 reduction cells easily 20 years behind that in terms of technological readiness and stability, especially. And then the output, you want to make something somebody cares about. You don't want to just detect it. You got to make a stream that someone would buy. Great. So on the input side, we want to take a baby step in this direction away from pure CO2. Flue gas, and very admit this was a baby step. You wouldn't think in flue gas, what's the nastiest stuff? You wouldn't name oxygen. It's the most benign from an environmental perspective, but it is challenging inside cells because the oxygen reduction reaction just takes over. So you can't do any CO2 reduction if you've got oxygen there. So anyway, my student Sheldon here looked at can we at least fight this oxygen battle and then come back for all the other nasties that are in flue gas. So he did this successfully and using some of the same tools that were associated with, looked at small channels in this case, not engineered channels, but pores and membranes and ionomers, and this keeping the catalyst wet did the trick. Basically, you just look for any way that CO2 could be differentiated from O2, and solubility was the ticket. So here he was able to get 60% Faradaic efficiency, and there's probably not too many people in the room that woke up this morning thinking about the Faradaic efficiency for CO2 and ethylene, but 60% ain't bad. It's sort of competitive with cases without oxygen. In the cell, how to make this thing more productive, efficient, and stable. This was a fun study. We looked at really, I think of this as a bit of a blowtorch. How do we extend the reactive area? This is something fuel cells folks have done for ages. And here we did use a metal ionomer hybrid catalyst, and we really just stretched that gas along the interface of the catalyst here. And part of the reason we had to do that is because the conditions at which CO2 reacts well into multi-carbon products are super alkaline. Super alkaline. So also when CO2 is beside a super alkaline solution, what happens? It converts to carbonates, right? So if you can see this little the modeling result here. If you just have the CO2 gas phase here, its loss to the electrolyte is super fast. So in this study, we were able to stretch it using an ionomer, sort of protect it a bit from the solution, stretch it along the catalyst, and we got some really high current densities. So 1 amp, I think fuel cell people would say that's respectable. Finally, CO2R is respectable current density, 1 amp. And we're certainly proud of this study. But what? This study came out, Matt Kanan, chemist at Stanford, really great and interesting guy and a great thinker in this area. And he really took the piss out of us. Can I say that? So he was saying this is terrible, right? I mean, this is a clever thing, and this is neat. But this, like losing your CO2 reactant to solution to your electrolyte, is a disaster, right? Because what do you do then? Well, then you have to, like, what do we do in practice in the lab? We just have this thing drink electrolyte, right? And you can't again regenerate that. So Matt calculated the energy cost for this, and by the way, not just us. I'm blaming us because this hit us like a ton of bricks. But the field in general, we're drinking electrolyte, and it wasn't at all sustainable. So he wrote this hard-hitting paper, and it really reoriented the field and our work over the last 2 years to really address this. So we're in his debt. Right. So if you look at the techno-economics of this, Matt was right. Even with the current lab data, you're way, all of these costs. In that alkaline case that I just showed, there's this huge purple band here for catalytic regeneration. That's getting your CO2 back out of that electrolyte. Terrible. There's no way you'll ever afford this. And we're hopeful that you can be able to do this, but in order to do this, you got to get rid of all the purple bands essentially. And you get to a market price that's tractable. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but everything's worth $1,000 a ton, like everything. What? It's like the international rule of $1,000 a ton. Sometimes it's 800, sometimes it's 12. But when I look at the price of anything, polyglycol, $1,000 a ton, 1,100. Why is everything $1,000 a ton? I'll never understand. Ethylene is $1,000 a ton. Carbonate formation, it's terrible. How do we avoid it? This was my student Adnan said, well, let's take something off the shelf. Let's go to Walmart and buy a solid oxide electrochemical cell, or maybe not Walmart, but whatever. Let's buy one. That'll take us from CO2 to CO, and then we'll do CO to whatever in our reactor. And yes, we'll pay some energy for this, but these guys have their crap together. This thing really works, and it's cheap. So that was a very effective approach. And I think for the most part, I've got a few solutions I'll show here. I think this is the one that the field is gravitating towards. This is where we came in and we innovated with this, and we got this thing to be stable. And as a result, you get down to relatively low energy input ethylene. And the key thing is that this is getting close to the thermodynamic minimum for making ethylene. It's about 50 gigajoules. So we're at 140. That's getting to the point where somebody might take you seriously. And we're operating for kind of 100 hours. So starting to become technologically relevant. You can do clever things on the anode. Through this slide in for electrochemically oriented folks. On the anode, what are we doing? Mostly OER, and then we throw the oxygen away. So we pay a lot of voltage and we don't do anything with it. So that's unfortunate. So my student looked at, can we do something more productive on the anode side? So here we looked at taking a product like crude glycerol, of which there's lots, and it's cheap, and turning it into some lactic acid or something. And we made the case in this paper that this is at least more valuable than that. So it'll pay for itself somehow. And at least we don't have to pay for OER, so we can get to even lower energy costs in our ethylene. Oops. A few other approaches I'll buzz through here. This was a clever kind of approach where we covered, essentially protected that catalyst from an acidic environment where the CO2 would regenerate itself. So we didn't lose that CO2 to carbonates, and we didn't let it go over to the anode side. So this worked fairly well. We had really good single pass conversion. So we had circumvented that big problem that Matt Kanan highlighted in his paper. But a few other problems. This thing wasn't that stable. Had some other issues. This paper is the first time I've been able to talk about this. This came out last week, and it's I love this because it really marries my history of microchannels. Right, this is a microchannel embedded layer inside a relatively large electrochemical cell, and those microchannels are doing what they do well. Right, they're taking the species at that condition in the bipolar membrane, in between the anion side, cation side, and letting that CO2 get out of there and recirculate back. So this keeps the CO2 from crossing over and causing a separation headache. And this was cute and was getting up to 77% of selectivity. So in other words, of the electrons that did work inside this system, 77% went to doing what we wanted them to do, which was to convert CO2 into multi-carbon products. The other ones went to hydrogen or other things. And then this thing was stable. This thing was stable for a couple hundred hours and counting. So this is in some ways putting together a few things. One is our goals, and then the other one is chunks of my past. Last stop, output side. Can we make something that's valuable? We've worked with a bunch of industrial partners, and one is Suncor Energy. They've been very generous. They want alternative ways to make ethanol. They make huge amounts of bioethanol now. What are some of the challenges with this process? Lots of CO2, competes with farmland, right? And you've heard a lot of the criticism of biofuel. That's not lost on Suncor. They're looking at alternatives, and one of them is electrocatalytic conversion of CO2 to ethanol. And one thing that I often think that working with industry is a bit of a secret weapon. because you can go to as many conferences on CO2 reduction as you want, and no one will say, that ethanol stream you're making, that's garbage, right? No one will say that because the Faraday efficiency of ethanol was 45% and it leaves the field. But it takes an industry person to say, wait, what concentration is that? That's 0.5%, right? There's a name for that, and it's not, you know, a valuable stream. So these guys were really helpful, and they said, listen, don't talk to us until you've got 10%, and that was just an axis on which the field was not operating, and we had and was important. So that was a great project, and we took a couple of approaches. This shows the problem. We'd make the ethanol, it would head over to the anode. Ethanol is really slippery. It's not charged. It wets everything. It loves membranes. It goes everywhere. It's a real headache, and it goes over here and dilutes, and then it can even reoxidize. And now we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. CO2 to ethanol, ethanol to CO2, and so the 0.58%. So we developed a system where the ethanol would be trapped in the middle, right? So we'd be able to sort of wash it out, and then by using electroosmotic flow on both sides in the membranes, be able to keep the slippery ethanol from diffusing back into the anode side. And as a result, we were able to get reasonably stable operation and 15%, or here 13% ethanol, which is like a Merlot kind of quality. I wouldn't drink it, but it's over 10% solution, and therefore of some value to industry. By the way, what comes off the digesters in the Suncor plant and other plants is 10%. So this could fit right in. We had an opportunity to scale this through the X Prize. This was the carbon. This was the carbon X Prize. This ran for 4 years leading up to a year ago. And we went through all the various stages. This was the finals in Calgary. It was a really awesome process. I'm happy to talk about it. It was such a great learning experience. The best thing that the X Prize does, in addition to give out a bunch of money to winners, perhaps even better than that, is it gives a deadline, right? There's a deadline and there's a big hairy goal. Because without that, if I said, hey, I really want $3 million because I want to scale this process we have in our little tiny lab, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, what would Total Energy say? What would U of T say? What would our funders say? They'd say, that's adorable, but why don't you try 10 times? Here's $100,000, right? But when you've got a big hairy goal and no projector, did I do something wrong? You've got an opportunity. So that was great. And all of a sudden you can get some money because you've got a deadline. Students are super jacked about it. They've got this incredibly impossible task, and it was fun. That's all right. I'm more or less just talking anyway. I'm just telling stories at this point. So the ultimate upstream source, looking beyond this to the next X Prize. So in that one, great experience, totally lost, but it was a lesson, and Kurt and I were talking about this earlier. It's a lesson in some ways that the simplest solution wins. And converting CO2 electrocatalytic into ethylene is not the simplest solution in that particular prize. I think it'll have a role to play. But the simplest one was sort of stirring CO2 into cement and makes sense. So last stop on this and is the ultimate upstream, which is direct air capture. And here, this is really motivated by some recent work we've been doing, and also by a second X Prize. This is Elon Musk's capture one, and how to win that one is really to take as much CO2 take the most amount of CO2 out of the air and do some permanent storage with it. So they don't want they want it the ultimate air source and permanent storage. So our team, Ned mentioned the Equester team. They've had some early success, so they got a little bit of Elon's money, like 250,000, which is not a lot when you're Elon. the ultimate prize is 100 million, and we'll just see if we survive to fight that battle. We'll just see. I'll come back in. Is it going back? No, just in time. Is it there now? Yep. Okay, great. Yeah, so this process, essentially, it's, you think of it, share this, right? Sorry. You need to reshare it. It's not a, oh, reshare it to the folks online. Yeah, that's right. That's right. There we go. That's working. Okay, great. Yeah, so big thanks to Curran and Heather and team who have helped us with this tech and really understand where there might be an opportunity cost-wise and where we need to get a lot more affordable. It's been great working with you folks. And yeah, so this team of 3 here, really plus UVic friends, has a pretty clever solution. It's in this blue box, and what does it do? It's carbon engineering. This is the carbon engineering's loop, but where they have a thermal, natural gas powered capture fluid regenerator, we have an electrochemical one. So that's the approach. And hopefully soon I can talk about more details in here, but it's sort of a combination, excuse me, of electrochemical systems and loops. And the key thing is we're taking a disciplined approach to gigajoules per ton, as one has to do when one's talking about the world's biggest commodity. And we're getting into competitive range, so sub 10 gigajoules per ton. The thermodynamic limit, I think, is something like 0.5 or 1. So there's still room to go, and there's a few players in the 5 to 10 range. But I'm hopeful that we can get to A, competitive total energy, and B, totally electrical. Does that make sense? I don't think we can compete by saying, yeah, we use more energy than those guys, but it's all electrical, people come from renewables. I don't think that's going to work in the end. I think it has to be both less energy and all electricity. And then I think we've got a hope. And here, CO2 is the product. And then, of course, could go downstream to storage. Elon would want storage. It could also go to conversion to displace other currently fossil provided processes. Great. So I talked about the CO2 challenge motivating, we focus on large scale, kind of in some ways fundamentally uncool chemicals and fuels. We really focus on the things that we use tons of each, because we think that's the only place to play when you think about conversion. And then tiny pipes have a role to play in informing operations, and then different role to play in making fluid when fluid's a product. Thanks to the group, but more importantly, thanks to you folks for your attention, for indulging me in a visit here and getting the opportunity to come back to UVic.
Thanks, Dave, for this very fun tour from the tiny to the big. And so questions from either the participants online or from the floor here.
Oh yeah.
Non-technical question.
Shoot.
When I listen to you talk about mercury, it actually shakes me out of some of the pessimism about where we're going. Global warming. I think that you seem to actually have some traction on these problems. And is your sense that there, how many Daves are there doing
Techno evangelists?
Yeah. How often do you run into people like yourself who you think are really doing work?
Yeah, I'd say quite a bit. Yeah. No, there is a lot of pessimism, isn't there?
Yeah.
But I guess it's not productive, right? That's the hard. I mean, a bit of it. You need a little pessimism to guide your path in this world, but I guess that's where I stop with it, just because it's I don't know what to do with it. So I think there's lots. Hopefully, an interesting interesting perspective came from a chat I had with a guy named Joseph. He's a U of T ethicist. He's a philosopher and a damn good one, and really interesting guy. And he's put forward this argument that you have to be techno optimistic because there's no other way. You know what I mean? There's no other way that would be ethical. And he uses lots of examples of which I won't give you very good ones, but even the idea of leaving oil on the ground when people need to eat, or in economies and regions where they haven't developed, and saying no, you can't do that. That really doesn't have a strong ethical basis. In Canada, saying to Alberta, yeah, by the way, cattle can't do that, and by the way, the oil and gas can't do that either. Those are lives and livelihoods, right? You have to have a pretty good argument in order to tell a province they have to change their lives and livelihoods. And he takes a perspective that there's a moral and an ethical bar to climb there that is probably beyond what we can do, which is interesting because usually the moral and the ethical side is more about we simply must, and we all feel that in this room. I feel that when we look at the environment, we simply must do better. There's that ethical side, but there's another ethical side, lives and livelihoods. So when you put those two in your head and you get the headache, the only thing that comes out is we got to find a better solution, right? And it's got to be cheap. So maybe it comes from desperation.
So on your practical side, you have run times are 70 to 200 hours publishing. When you look at the stuff, it's like, well, this has to work for 6 months, years.
Right.
Do you have a sense of the disconnect there between lab scale run times and scaling it up to operational? What your investment partners say about that?
Yeah. I guess it's going to follow the path that fuel cells did, right? And electrolyzers did. And as the field does, just script as much as we can from all of that fuel cell, those learnings. But it is a hiccup. Yeah, I don't know. In there, what am I most grumpy about? Stability. I think we'll get there. Some of these now, and even our big scale system, it had other problems, but the stability of the power coming in started to become a problem. We were starting to get that thing ran for 30 days, 24 hours a day. It's still not where it needs to be, but I think our other problems are bigger, like energy efficiency is not high enough. Ferritic efficiency to one product is not high enough. I talked a lot about multi-carbon products today. Ultimately processes need one product, right? They don't want ethanol and ethylene and a little propanol mixed with a little CO. They want one product. So getting that purity, I think that's a bigger headache. And stability, it's a big one, but I'd say it's challenge number 3 or 4. And because I think we've got that. In the lab now, pumps are dying. I ask students, why did you stop at 200 hours? And it's just because they were tired or because the pump died. We're starting to get stable, at least. Yeah.
We have one comment online. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, it's good. Let's have a comment online.
So it's not a question, but it's a comment from here regarding that there's no precedent for replacing an energy source. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, right? So he says horse and cattle-based mechanical energy has disappeared, at least in some parts of the world.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah. We changed our. I guess what were we feeding those cows? We were feeding them biomass, right? And then now we're feeding our mechanical cows gasoline. Yeah. So we switched, right? I guess I would say point taken, but I would also say biomass hasn't tanked, right? We saw it flat. It was flat. So I guess we've got more horses.
You already that's a technology change.
Right.
Not
Not a fuel change.
That's
Yeah.
right, yeah. It's often an example that I've given to people in terms of going back to a renewable, quote, renewable
Right.
sort of system, right? With the feedstock, sort of the bucket behind the horse.
Right. The true
Yeah.
feedstock.
Dave, just wondering if you can comment in terms of your thoughts about the fact that many of the solutions that are being promoted indicate that we clearly have to go to an energy system that's much more decentralized and distributed. Okay. Now, many of the things you've talked about, from an industrial standpoint and economic standpoint, they require large scale centralized plants because of the economies of scales, which mean that either you have to bring in the feedstock, or alternatively you have to take out the product, and it adds up to the whole life cycle system. And I was wondering whether the tiny pipes approach opens up opportunities for having small distributed systems that are economically viable.
Yeah, I hope so. The one, I heard that argument come most recently. We were trying to pitch to the eQuestra project at DAC to an investor. They didn't like anything except they thought maybe we could be modular when other systems can't, right? They think of carbon engineering and others are going to be large scale systems. By their nature, ours, like a fuel cell, can be modular. So I'm hopeful. So it's interesting. I haven't pursued that, but I'm hopeful that it might take something like that. It's almost like the bio guys, myself included, making a nutraceutical because at least they could get paid to do it at some reasonable level, right? And then hopefully that tech peppers down to the transport fuel, maybe small modular things for Microsoft or Stripe. Cool demos can eventually scale out. I think it's
And could eventually someone do some of these processes. Every home has its own.
Yeah,
that's sort of the upper limit.
it is.
Yeah.
I like it. I mean, the only concern I have is that in the back of my head, I think, well, there's just nothing like a centralized plant, right? I mean, the efficiencies, refineries, and I know not everyone thinks of them as beautiful, or maybe nobody thinks of them beautiful, but it's just an orgy of efficiency, right? Like you've just got every flow. There's an MBA and a chemical engineer saying, what temperature is that at? What pressure is that at? What's the fuel value? Okay, what can we squeeze out of that piece, right? It's just a giant, it's so efficient. And anytime you ever do something smaller, you lose so much of that. So the engineer in me worries about distributed stuff just not being that good. But that doesn't mean I won't invoke the sales pitch if I need it.
The slide you had on stimulated geothermal, using horizontal drilling, that was interesting because a lot of the hot dry rock research focuses on fracturing.
Hot dry rock,
in order to connect the wells on both sides. What's your sense of the kind of interplay between horizontal drilling and fracturing? It's obviously for oil and gas, you always use both. For shale deposits, but stimulated geothermal is kind of a different animal. Yeah,
you're right. It's kind of in between those two things, right? It's using the fracturing piece from oil and gas, but in order to make the connection. Yeah, I think it's a contender. You probably wouldn't need me for that because you'd just be using water because you'd be interacting with the reservoir a lot more, right? The only place where we can be of value is when you've got a closed system and then you can afford to spend some money on your working fluid, if that makes sense. You can't afford to put too exotic into an open reservoir that you don't have control over. So I think in a very me only, like what we can bring to the tech, the closed loop thing is a hit for us when the open one or the fractured one isn't. In general, though, is that a pathway that's interesting? I think it is. A little bit like, we were just trading sales pitches there on distributed versus centralized. Those guys trade sales pitches on fracturing induces seismicity. The closed loop guys would say we don't fracture. They compete on that kind of basis. But I think all the geothermal stuff is interesting. Something I'd love to get into is renewable heat. I couldn't believe I should have known this, but heat is what we do use energy for, right? It's our number one use case. It's like the biggest thing we do with energy. So it seems important, and we don't have a great solution for it. Heat pumps would be the only one that shine out is pretty amazing. But beyond that, like high temperature heat processes for cement, for steel, where do you get that from? That's a great problem. Yeah. So in geothermal, all in that mix, I think geothermal is interesting, and yeah, I'd cheer those guys that are fracturing to make the connection. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, we're gonna need all that.
All right.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks to folks online.
Thanks again, Dave.
No, this is great, and good discussion as well.